Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of IHST. In this episode, we have the honor of having Dr. Bahareh Sahebi, and I'm going to give you a short bio of Dr. Sahebi, and after that, we just dive into a conversation. Dr. Bahareh Sahebi is a PsyD LMFD, is a clinical psychologist and a licensed marriage and family therapist. Dr. Sahebi is a clinician with a full caseload of couples and families and an AMFD approved supervisor, consultant, and mentor for early to mid-career clinicians for advanced systemic trainings in her own private practice. Her integrative systemic clinical practice addresses a broad range of patient concerns, and she has developed a specialty in the treatment of trauma. She served as an educator, currently serving as a professor of psychology at Rosalind Franklin University School of Medicine and Science, where she provides a graduate level training for master's and PhD in clinical psychology. Um, Dr. Sahebi is also author and editor. We're engaged in clinical insights publication and an active board member and editor of the APA branch 43 Couple and Family Journals. Noteworthy is Dr. Saebi's 2020 article, Clinical Supervision of Couple and Family Therapy During COVID-19, is a foundational publication by Family Process and documented by the National Institute of Health's widely public health emergency collection as a useful reference. Dr. Sahebi is the co-author of the widely received and utilized book, Integrative Systemic Therapy in Practice, a clinician's handbook published by Routledge in 2020. Dr. Sahebi's tenure includes serving as the former clinical assistant professor of psychology and the assistant program director in the Master of Science in Marriage and Family Therapy program at Northwestern University. With extensive experience in program development in both mental health agencies and corporate settings, Dr. Sahebi is the recipient of the 2018 Dr. Christian Barr Compassion and Skill in Rehabilitation Practice Award, nominated by the Illinois chapter of the International Association of Rehabilitation Professionals. Wow. She is also the recipient of the 2020 Distinguished Teaching Excellence Award for the Marriage and the Family Therapy Program, the Center for Applied Psychological and Family Studies at Northwestern University. Dr. Sahebi served as an elected board of the director members for the Illinois Affiliation of Marriage and Family Therapists from 2021 to 2020. It's such an honor to have you, Dr. Sahebi. Welcome and hi.
I so appreciate your invitation to have this conversation, this very important conversation during a very important time in our lives. So thank you for having me.
I know, of course. So I know that the audience still don't know what we are going to talk about, but it all started from your presentation at the previous AMFD in Florida. And I want you to talk about that presentation in more depth and also tell us what inspired you to focus on the intersection of the global mental health, religious trauma, and the feminist movement in your presentation.
Sure. Thank you for the question. The world has been facing, not just this year, it has been going on for quite a while, where the world is facing a silent yet devastating epidemic. And the global mental health crisis is something that we've all talked about, we continue to talk about, without much direction and knowing which parts we should focus on. This is a worldwide emergency that continues to get worse and worse, especially after the pandemic hit in 2020, and is exacerbated by a lack of infrastructure, lack of funding, lack of health equities available. Now, when we say the movement of global mental health, like globalmentalhealth.org, it was actually something that was launched in October of 2008. And it was a coalition of individuals and institutions that came together, and they committed to collective actions that aim to close the treatment gaps, if they could, for people living with mental health disorders worldwide. I found their work so interesting, and I've been following it for quite a while. And that was one of the reasons why I even went into systemic therapies and learning systemic work, not just from the family, but also the larger realm. Global mental health, as we're defining it, involved the study, the research, the practice of improving mental health for all people worldwide. And this is something that is taking place a lot more outside of the United States, yet we do have more and more researchers and clinicians engaging in this work. It takes into consideration disparities in mental health treatments and care across cultures and countries too. As more and more migrations have taken place, the more and more we have needed to understand the impact of global mental health in this regard. So the NIH, the British Journal of Psychiatry, the movements of global mental health have all really started in in 2011, and after that, in a focus on this. Now, we also know that globally, people seek therapy for a variety of issues, right? But some of the ones that overlap are mental health conditions such as mood disorders like anxiety, stress, depression, and more and more and more regarding trauma and PTSD. Now, I specifically in this presentation focused on one specific type of trauma, and that was religious trauma. The term religious trauma, I would like to define that early here, just so everybody's clear on what we're talking about. It gained significance and gained attention in a wider discussion around 2011, same time that global mental health was beginning to launch. And this is when psychologist Marilyn Winell coined the term religious trauma syndrome specifically. So we want to make sure that she gets the credit for this, for bringing this phenomenon to describe it to the larger audience. Before that, we would just address it as trauma. But she was making the point where the concept became more readily discussed within mental health field as its own entity. And among those experiences, the significance of it was that it's marked by a point where the experiences of the individuals leaving or feeling harmed by their religious communities were given a specific terminology and framework to understand and address their needs and their issues. And that's really helpful, right? Sometimes when we have a word to describe the feeling that we have been feeling, it's very healing in itself, just knowing that there is a terminology that explains our experiences as humans. Religious trauma can actually be categorized as a developmental or complex trauma, CPTSD, and may arise from repeated and prolonged traumatization through religious abuse specifically. So when I first started talking about global mental health, bringing that together with religious trauma, I wanted to focus on who are the populations that seem to be impacted the most by religious trauma based on disparities. And more and more readings that I did and research that I did, I found that intersectional feminism was a term that came up over and over and over again. So Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw from UCLA, a psychologist from UCLA, came up with this term. And decades ago, she had talked about this. And to ensure that women living in the US weren't just fighting for themselves to climb up the corporate ladder, which was the movement that was happening in the 80s for women. But she also wanted women to think and care for about women throughout the developing world, like in Africa continent and countries like Afghanistan and Iran and other places where intersectional feminism plays a huge role. What's what is happening, for example, in Iran, which was the main point, the main example that I was using in my presentation, was what happened in Iran impacts women everywhere, just like what happens in America.
Mhm.
Um, that happens to affects women everywhere. So when women in Europe, for example, when they were fighting for the rights to vote in England, that spread throughout the world. That's where it all started. It was a new movement that gave a global energy for women's right to vote.
Mhm.
Another one is, when birth control became a norm, that spread around the world as well. And it was very helpful to women and the goals that they had, the lives that they wanted to lead, and gave women more autonomy in how they wanted to, go through their lives.
Mhm.
So the point that Dr. Crenshaw was trying to make was that you either fight for feminism and women's right everywhere, or you're not fighting for them at all, anywhere. It is women's rights are human rights, right?
Mhm.
And that was what I had said in the presentation. And it's not based on nationality and nation state. Feminism is either intersectional, it's not feminism at all.
Mhm.
And as you know, when feminist movement may have started with women's equality, but intersectional feminism actually addresses equality for all in
Mhm.
terms of rights that they would have, human rights, basic human rights that all humans have. And we begin to explore these uprisings of feminist movements globally and the contributions of transgenerational and systemic complex trauma became clearer and clearer through education, education, education. The more women were educated, the more this concept became, a critical analysis of we're living differently. Also, the uprising of social media and media in general that we can view all over the world, the internet, the more people were traveling, the more they were able to hear other women's stories, other family stories. I'm an Iranian American woman who is a
Mhm.
psychologist, author, and educator. And I was able to have this opportunity for myself to continue pushing those boundaries to get myself the rights that I wanted to have, whether it was in the familial realm or it was in the larger context. I was able to, and because of my own experiences, I was able to quickly see how the intersection of these three areas of attention needed a platform to be talked about together. These may have been talked about separately in different realms, but really together they didn't have a space. With our ability to connect globally and learn about experiences of women together more easily, with our ability to be able to have more conversations, even with more migration that's happened around us, we can no longer just sit and categorize just different experiences as just a cultural phenomenon or anything else. But we really have to see these overlapping impact of complex trauma endured leading to movements that we're seeing now. They didn't come out of nowhere. We see today globally, one of which has been a result of religious trauma, that in many cases has been weaponization of religion and spiritual beliefs in the past, and has silenced women and has limited what they could do. This was something that I had not seen discussed before, and I really wanted the opportunity to put them together, shed some light in how our current zeitgeist is feeding into all of these great concepts that people that I honored mentioned have brought into light, and connect them together so we can have more discussions. And the more discussions we have, the more activism we can do, because I see part of our role as a mandatory activism, that we cannot just sit in silence, and we have to do whatever it is that we are capable of doing. And this was my form of activism in our profession. And I thank American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy for allowing me and two of my colleagues who were my former students to have this presentation.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. That was such a great context to, set that there and, look at the whole conversation from that perspective. I remember I think it was in 2022 when the Women Life Freedom happened in Mahsa Amini. I was teaching both in person and online. And in every opportunity that I had, including my classes, I talked about what's happening in Iran for at least like 5 minutes. And then after I talked about or showing a video or whatever, I told students that you may, in your head, you may say, okay, I'm sorry for what's happening. And, I have empathy for people of Iran, but what can I do, right? Iran is a third world country, or this is not like I cannot do anything for changing the regime or stuff like that. And then I told them, if you are thinking that way, you are wrong because this is, as you mentioned, it's a global issue. Like in the US, most powerful country in the world, women still, they are fighting for their rights, including like abortion right, like your body, all these different things. So women's rights and issue, they're not just about like some specific countries. It's a kind of like global thing that we should be mindful of, and we should be public. They should have public actions about them, right? Advocacy is not just like having empathy for people, right? It's like just public
That's
action.
right. That's right.
Yeah. So I really appreciate that. So I know that you discussed the impact of religious trauma on feminist revolutions. Could you share some examples of how feminist movements have navigated or responded to this trauma?
Sure. I would like to talk about how and who religious trauma impacts. So it is not just women in one realm. Globally, the communities and individuals at risk who experience religious traumas are LGBTQ communities, those living under highly controlled systems, religious dictatorships, theocracies, family institutional or cultural systems that value a purity culture as part of the sexual morality standards for women. For example, the evangelical fundamentalist church is one example of those. And, some of the specific examples we can think of those who may have been impacted by religious trauma are somebody who, for example, is leaving an Orthodox religious community and not being able to have any rights to their own children legally. Or when we hear stories in the news like honor killing being protected by law, not even being that happening in your family, but just that you live in a system where honor killing is protected by law. And the rape of girls and women being executed based on the fabricated religious law that states virgins cannot be killed. That's one huge part of this. And so keeping women out of the activism and protesting roles just because they are afraid of that being raped before execution. Being in a Catholic church is another example. Rape survivor and being shunned by the community and church and dismissed by the law for reporting the abuse. And that's across the gender spectrum. It's not just a women's issue. So in countries such as Iran and Afghanistan, in the example that I wanted to share with everybody, within a non-secular government, and that's the Islamic Republic, where all laws are based on religious rules that are man-made religious rules for political gain and a weaponization for control within the society. They have been used for decades now. And it really had become something, although it was a huge shock in the beginning, it soon became something where the society gained apathy in order to just survive. And part of that may have been the shock factor of how do we even navigate this? As the world became more connected through the things that we talked about, education, global network, all of that, it was more, everybody was exposed to different lifestyle, connected with social media, able to talk about these things, accepted as things felt that they weren't acceptable in the same way. And everybody started questioning and critically thinking about the impact of religious rules and laws and the inequality between the genders as a whole, such as in Iran, women having to wear a hijab, a head covering, in public, and men didn't have to. The way that they dress is completely different. Or laws related to adultery, for where women are stoned to death, but men may be excused for that adultery very easily. Or the ability to even travel or rent a hotel room for a woman by themselves, or even leave the country. They cannot do that. As well as inheritance laws. Women get half of what a man receives if they are from the same family even. So these things weren't just something that women started to see the difference in lifestyle. There are many, many millions and millions and millions of men who are feminists and who also are fighting along for equal rights, because this kind of pressure isn't just on women. It also has adverse reactions on the system where men are part of that system. In response to that global feminist revolution in Iran, which is a gender apartheid society, and there is so much sex segregation that I mentioned, this history of compulsory hijab really became an issue at some point. And in 2017 was not the first time we saw any kind of rebelliousness against that compulsory hijab, but it was the first time that there was a campaign that was named and globally recognized as the White Wednesday campaign. And this concept is very simple. In order for women to protest the Islamic Republic in Iran's laws mandating them at that time for wearing the hijab in public, every Wednesday women wear white and publicly take off their white scarf, and they would just let their hair loose and stand on a platform with a stick that was holding their white scarf. Now, that campaign led to so many more, and as generations changed, more and more rebelliousness by women. And finally, in September 2022, after the murder of Mahsa Amini, the women life freedom movement started, as you mentioned, that has actually moved way beyond just women's right for hijab, but rights for equality for all, economic disparities, and it's a revolution that continues to play out in different forms. So the experience of having all of these things and watching it from afar, and I'm using Iran as an example now. I want to make sure that everybody is aware that every one of those experiences that I mentioned earlier, like leaving the Orthodox religion or Catholic Church or honor killing or LGBT communities that are shunned because they're not held in their communities when they are said the Bible doesn't accept their identity and who they are. All of those need a platform and are worthy of a platform. So I hope that the listeners that are listening to our conversation are inspired by this to start talking about some of the other examples that we're giving here in the same realm, because we have a lot of work ahead of us to do. And every single one of the communities impacted deserve that kind of space.
Thank you. Thank you so much for talking about that. So you mentioned the audience, and some of the audience at IHS, the International Journal of Systemic Therapy, are therapists. So what are some of the strategies for therapists working with clients who struggle with religious trauma while also trying to maintain a connection to their culture or spiritual roots?
Great question. Culture is something that it's ever changing and updating naturally in a society in response to the zeitgeist, in response to generational experiences, and all layers of the systemic experiences of individuals and families. So, one thing that happens for diaspora of any population that move outside of their home is it's almost like their view of cultures, their own cultural origin, stays frozen in time. So I had moved here in the mid 80s from Iran. So my view of Iran is really frozen, like what people do, at New Year's time or winter time. When I think back to some experiences, it really is dependent on the last experiences that I had there, and everything else just doesn't seem like it's part of my culture. That's a really important thing to consider, to be able to not just accept the culture of anyone in diaspora who is, for clinicians to accept that as the truth, but rather challenge it as, is it the part of the frozen cultural realm that they have been struggling with to as part of their grief and loss of what they left behind in a nostalgic way? Or is it the culture that the people of that culture can now talk about and relate to? And so that's the first thing that I want to talk about systemically. So that's the systemic look in what they need to consider. Outside of that, we want to look at the layers of the self, the experience of the self, such as the individuals with religious trauma are questioning their own moral compass and any negative self-evaluation, impeding trust in oneself and others in the world, confusion about where one's personality ends and the indoctrination begins. All of these, just a spiritual identity crisis in general. All of these are things that need to be really looked through from a lens of shame, fear, uncertainty, because that experience of self can sometimes feel that rejection of the culture of origin is equivalent to rejection of the whole self. So we cannot separate those when there is that sort of complex trauma involved. Religious trauma may shift and shape the experience of one's inner world through a lens of shame, as I said, and particularly true for those who live within a paradoxical reality. That's why I use the example of Iran, because in Iran, behind closed doors, most people live exact opposite of the way that they present outside. And that's a really interesting concept that I really would like the listeners to be able to have a dialogue about with other Iranians that they know, or be able to look up and learn more about, because that paradoxical reality is a huge component of that loss of culture and loss of self, and where does self and the other part begins. Another thing that anybody who is working with religious trauma in these examples that I'm giving is understanding cognitive and affective experiences that the clients may have. That's challenges with self-regulation, the experience of guilt about the lifestyles of choice. Definitely a whole lot of survivor's guilt may contribute to patterns of self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways, even if the survivor's guilt isn't about how they have survived now compared to any family and friends that they have left behind, but also intergenerational survivor's guilt, where even if they have moved as a whole family, the daughter may feel that survivor's guilt because they know that their mother at their age did not have the experiences that they're having right now. So this is the part of the unconscious process that is always at play. Shame about one's cultural identity and inferiority within the dominant culture, generalized anger, not knowing what the anger is about, self-guardedness on primary emotions, rigid thinking, intrusive thoughts. These are all contribute, and the intrusive thoughts, by the way, aren't always related to this example, but intrusive thoughts about anything just to keep going, memory issues, perceptual salience and sensory salience. That's the overall literature that consists of demonstrating that bottom-up sensory salience, increasing the probability of the object that's successfully selected. So bottom up, meaning from the biological mechanisms, the physiological mechanisms that they're experiencing, such as rapid heartbeat, headaches, dizziness, for no reason. So that's the cognitive and affective experiences. There's also behavioral symptoms that clinicians need to be mindful of. Perfectionism, hypervigilance, a compulsive need to perform, exist in a particular manner that oscillates between avoiding punishment or provoking reenactment of some sort. Interpersonal challenges like emotional cutoffs, intimacy and sexual challenges of feeling shame during sex, even if it is with the person that they've committed to. So these are very, very important areas that therapists who are working with religious trauma of any sort need to look at: the self, the culture, the cognitive and affective experience, and behavioral symptoms.
So many different directions and things that we should be mindful of. And I particularly love your background and the kind of like combination of clinical psychology and kind of like MFT and systemic perspective. And like in the whole conversation, it's just so interesting for me, and I appreciate that. I know that Dr. Sahebi, like when you started the conversation, you mentioned Kimberly Crenshaw, and I'm wondering, in your experience, what are some of the biggest challenges to achieving truly intersectional feminist advocacy these days?
Yes. There are three main themes that I've noticed come up. One is people having the fear of insulting someone's spiritual beliefs or religion or traditions. For example, the concept of Islamophobia, that comes up for people in not stepping into the activism role of fighting for intersectional feminism. Another one is fear of imperialism. That is, maybe these are our Western values that we don't want to intrude on other cultures that's outside of Western white values. Maybe that's where the issue is. So, I like to talk about some of this in terms of what is feminism, like we started in our conversation in the beginning. I think there is a huge difference between Islamic feminists and it's not what I think, it actually is true, Islamic feminists versus feminism that we talk about. Islamic feminists, or more accurately, Muslim feminists, these are women's rights advocates who seek to improve the status of women through more favorable interpretations of the Islamic law, supporting what's called dynamic interpretation. Some Muslim feminists prefer the term indigenous feminist, so we may hear that quite a lot too. As we're thinking about women's right and feminism, we have to be very careful in not to think about it in terms of that cultural component of Islamic feminism. We have to be very careful in not stepping into the realm of, again, culture playing a role and saying we don't want, this would be imperialism or insulting somebody else's religion, because this is not about insulting anybody's religion, but rather having women have the choices, having lawful choices to make about how they would like to live and what they would like to do. I don't think there is anyone who believes in equality who can say that it is okay that we just accept women should receive half of an inheritance that a man receives, even though they're siblings from the same family, only because they're women, or that women just automatically have to be stoned to death for adultery, and the man can go to jail, not go to jail, nothing happens to him. I refuse to believe that there is any type of human being that would put that in a cultural realm. But what I've noticed is people reject automatically some of the notions of getting involved in global intersectional feminism because they're afraid of these types of notions. And I'm here to say, please, let's not mix these things up. Let's at least have conversations so you feel comfortable as the listener to actually step into this realm, because it's really going to take all of us who believe in human rights everywhere in order to make this change happen.
That is very true. That is very true. As we're having this conversation, I felt different emotions in myself. Obviously because of the past religious trauma and the whole like the different things that I've experienced in my life. But so Dr. Saebi, we have like different we have had different movements, feminist movements around the world, right? For example, the one in South Korea versus like women life freedom in Iran. So what do you think, how these movements inform each other, and what are some of the kind of like takeaways for us as global citizens?
Yes, thank you for asking that. You know, the B2 movement was something that I learned from my colleague who was presenting with me, Rosie Kim and Harim. I want to honor both of them for being present there and actually teaching me so much about some of the other movements that have been going on simultaneously, like the one that you mentioned in South Korea. And, you know, it is important that we look at them and seeing what are some of the common denominators around global movements like that. Feminists that include men are taking power back by challenging the norms and expectations through their actions. So, for example, in South Korea, the women are really standing up to completely reject and boycott the notions of no marriage, no childbirth, no romance, no sexual relationships, even though the statistics have shown that more than half of the women are interested in becoming mothers and want to have children. 65% do. So this isn't something that they're just fighting for their own needs, their own personal needs, but they are fighting for the something much bigger than just the needs that they have. They may not want that for themselves, but they're fighting for others. Women fed up with traditionalist societies, unrealistic expectations of being mothers. Part of what is happening in South Korea, the same type of thing is taking place in Iran and in many other countries where they are rejecting a traditionalist society and notions of living together, even though they're not married, which is a very traditional way to look, or being with somebody who choosing a partner that they want of the same gender, non-binary, rather than the same, what we consider as in a traditional society as a man and a woman. What is very, very interesting here that I want to point out is that the president of South Korea actually blamed feminism, the word feminism, for blocking heterosexual relationships and actually removed feminism from textbooks. Now, when I read this maybe 6 months ago and I found out about it, I just couldn't believe that that was happening in South Korea, because we all know these things have been going on in Iran and Afghanistan and many other parts of the world where they are omitting parts of reality and movements and history and experiences, normal natural experiences from textbooks, from books, so that censorship begins. Now, what is extremely hurtful now that we're seeing, as you and I sit in the United States, we are actually seeing that the National Science Foundation grants are now changed under the Trump administration and the Republican administration, that if, for example, words like female, women, systemic, and trauma, just to name a few, there are a long list that I hope everybody goes and looks at. The NSF has already said that the grants will be automatically rejected. They're looking for these words to reject any publications we have. That is not only against our First Amendment and our constitutional right, but it's a direct rejection and fight with intersectional feminism. So when I say that it's important when we fight for women everywhere, it's not feminism. We saw this happen in North Korea or South Korea. We saw this happen in Iran decades ago. And now it's here in the United States. So we really, anybody who considers themselves a feminist, who fights for, believes in equality for marginalized populations, and women are part of marginalized populations when we don't have autonomy for and rights to our own body anymore in the United States. This is the time we need to come together, collaborate, email one another, call one another, be able to put thoughts together in different ways. We can write, we can stand up, we can interview, we can find different ways of being active in order to fight this rejection of being a woman.
Yes. Yes to everything. It's very important. And as you were talking, like the first time that I saw the blacklist of that, the list of the words, I can't believe it's 2025 and like, what is this? And like, anyway, it's unbelievable. So Dr. Saebi, I could keep talking to you for hours and hours, but I want to honor your time and thank you so much for, dedicating your time and, sharing your wisdom with all of us. Is there any kind of like last word and last thing that you want to talk about this topic? I know that it's very important. Again, like we can talk about it for hours, but any last word, anything that you want to draw attention to?
Yeah, I think this is the time that no matter where we are in our clinical practice and our research that we've done, this is the time we need to regroup and think about clinical implications in more detail. And we need to do it together. So none of us are really experts in this topic. We're all learning this together, because perhaps at times we've been fighting in our own little bubbles within different cultures or different geographical locations. But it is time for us to come together and fight this. And, if my name is looked up, there are articles that I have written related to this and the Iranian women life freedom movement in the last several years that folks can read. But I did share something that I wrote for the folks that were present at the presentation to hear, but I would like to share that here. And I like this to be my parting words for everyone to kind of sit with and think about as professionals who are critical thinkers and systemic. So Curiosity carries the energy to gravitate toward seeking knowledge. What is knowledge? Knowledge has the power to connect us. That's what's happening here. Connections rewire the way we understand the other and shift the dynamics of our attachment patterns from a cellular level. We have seen this over and over and over again in research by Dr. Daniel Siegel, through EFT research that has come out. We have seen so much of this, and we need to pay attention to how things shift from a cellular level. And it's through that connection and rewiring. Understanding the other can help us gain wisdom and heal old wounds for them and us. That's what makes our jobs as clinicians so exciting. Gained wisdom may lead to a new life narrative and change the course we thought we were predestined to live, in a way, and make the impossible possible. That courage to learn something new starts with us. And what new curiosity walks away with us from listening to a podcast, from reading an article or a book, or having a conversation from a friend, that curiosity that we walk away with, if then we become more and more curious and have the courage to expand that knowledge and have more conversations, is really the only way that we can fight this from every which way. And I hope that those are the parting words that listeners are taking away and walking away with.
Those were like excellent and amazing. I'm going to think about them for the rest of the day tonight. Thank you so much for sharing them, and such a great and deep way of ending this time that we had together. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Sahebi, and then we're going to see each other hopefully soon after this.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.